Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for tuning in today. This is the Bodega Cat Book Club Financial Edition. And today we're continuing our reading of The Creature from Jekyll Island by G. Edward Griffin. And this is the fifth edition. You can get that on Amazon. I'll leave the link in the description box below if you want to buy it. And I think if anybody who's interested in finance and money and history, this is a good book to have in your library. So the subtitle is called A Second Look at the Federal Reserve. And I wanted to read this book because I think it's important to understand how money works, how the history of what the history of money is, because we're so embedded in the money system, in the monetary system. It's almost like we can't get out of it, right? And in a way, our money system currently is like a slave system, in my opinion. And understanding its history and how it works and the game that they play, they meaning the money people, right? The politicians, policymakers, bankers, etc., etc. The game that they play, we understand their game and the rules of the game, then we have a better chance of succeeding in this world, in my opinion. So, um, let me know what you think. It's very interesting, eh? Interesting world that we live in. So, just a little plug before we begin. We have other book clubs that we put out. Mondays, we have our spiritual book clubs where we read spiritual books. Wednesdays, we have our health book club where we read anything health related, good health on the positive health, right? Um, Positive side. How to stay healthy, live longer. I think living longer is a byproduct of just staying healthy and taking care of yourself. And then, of course, Thursdays, we have the financial book clubs. And we have all that on our YouTube channel. So you could check out our YouTube channel. And we also have our past books that we've read on our YouTube channel as well and on our website. So you could check out our website and our YouTube channel. Either way. If you have any book recommendations you want the book club to read, I'll leave a link in the description box below, and you can suggest books for us to read, and we'd love to consider it. We like classic books because they have stood the test of time. Their knowledge is very deep, very lot of wisdom. Of course, with any books that and with any information and any knowledge, you want to read it with a grain of salt, right? Always, uh, what's the word I want? You want to validate it with your own intuition, with your own logic, with your own experience. You always want to do that. But we love to read. Reading makes you smarter. It expands your imagination. It expands your brain cells. It regenerates new brain cells. So it does make you smarter if you read a lot. And rich people, successful people are avid readers. If you listen to their biography, listen to their, history, the story, if you will. So, yeah, so come join us. And we have regular monthly newsletters that we put out. You can check that out on our website as well. Also, podcasts that we put out. I try to do it regularly, but it kind of depends on who the universe sends my way to interview. But the people that I've interviewed are pretty interesting, in my opinion. And if you find this helpful, you want to support us, you can buy me a coffee or check out our merch and support us that way. And then lastly, if you're local in the Los Angeles area, or if you're traveling to the Los Angeles area on vacation or whatever, come see us in person. We have a healing center that we use, technology based on Nikola Tesla's scalar wave research for holistic healing for both domestic animals, cats and dogs, as well as humans. So you could learn more about that on our website as well. And come join us, and we love to get to know you and meet you in person. There's nothing like community, especially in person, face to face community. That's how businesses are done, face to face. It should be, anyways. The old fashioned way, right? And the energy is different than if you would have met face to face on Zoom or something, right? Nothing beats nothing beats a flesh face to face, flesh and blood kind of community relationship. So, anyways, okay, enough of that. So, hope you guys check us all out. And we're gonna uh start reading. Okay, so this is The Creature from Jekyll Island, and this is chapter 21 and part 2. So I hope you guys are having a great time reading this book. I know I am. This book is very thick, and I applaud you guys for sticking it out so far. We will be continuing to read this book until probably beginning of next year. So it took us, it'll be a year and a little bit over a year and a month probably to finish this book. So you guys are troopers for hanging in there. All right. So this is, like I said, chapter 21, part 2. And let me move the camera in a little bit. If you have a book, you could follow with us there. If not, you can follow with us here on camera. Whatever works for you. Okay, here we go. The Aldrich Bill. The first draft of the Jekyll Island plan was submitted to the Senate by Nelson Eldridge, but due to the senator's unexpected illness when he returned to Washington, it was actually written by Frank Vanderlip and Benjamin Strong. And a footnote on that was Vanderlip from Farm Board to Financier, page 72. Although it was co-authored by, although it was co-authored by Congressman Vreeland, it immediately became known as the Aldrich Bill. Vreeland, by his own admission, had little to do with it either, but his willingness to be a team player in the game of national deception was of great value. Writing in the August 25th, 1910 issue of The Independent, which incidentally was owned by Aldrich himself and was anything but independent, Vreeland said, "The bank I propose is an ideal method of fighting monopoly. It could not possibly itself become a monopoly, and it would prevent other banks combining into monopolies. With earnings limited to 4.5%, there could not be a monopoly." And that quote was from A Better System of Banking and Currency by Edward B. Vreeland, The Independent, August 25, 1910, page 394. What an amazing statement. It is brilliantly insidious because of the half-truths it contains. It is true that monopolies cannot, or at least do not, operate at 4.5% interest. But it is untrue that the Federal Reserve banks were to be held to that lowly rate. It is true that 4% was the stated amount they would earn on the stock purchased in the system. But it is also true that the real profits were to be made not from stock dividends, but from the harvesting of interest payments on fiat money. To this was to be added the profits made possible from operating on smaller safety margins, yet still being protected from bankruptcy. Furthermore, being on the inside of the nation's central bank would make them privy to the important money-making data and decisions long before their competitors. The profits that could be derived from such an advantage would be equal to or even greater than those from the Mandrake mechanism. It is true that the Federal Reserve was to be a private institution, but it is certainly not true that this was to mark the disappearance of the government from the banking business. In fact, it was just the opposite, because it marked the appearance of the government as a partner with private bankers and as the enforcer of their cartel agreement. Government would now become more deeply involved than ever before in our history. Half truths and propaganda notwithstanding, the organizational structure proposed by the Aldrich Bill was similar in many ways to the old Bank of the United States. It was to have the right to convert federal debt into money, to lend that money to the government, to control the affairs of regional banks, and to be the depository of government funds. The dissimilarities were in those provisions which gave the creature more privilege and power than the older central bank. The most important of these was the right to create the official money of the United States. For the first time in our history, the paper notes of a banking institution became legal tender, not only for public debts, but for private ones as well. Henceforth, anyone refusing to accept these notes would be sent to prison. The words, quote, the United States of America, were to appear on the face of every note along with the Great Seal of the United States Treasury. And of course, the signature of the treasurer himself would be printed in a conspicuous location. All of this was designed to convince the public that the new institution was surely an agency of the government itself, turning the opposition against itself. Now that the basic strategy was in place and a specific bill had been drafted, the next step was to create popular support for it. This was the critical part of the plan, and it required the utmost finesse. The task actually was made easier by the fact that there was a great deal of genuine opposition to the concentration of financial power on Wall Street. Two of the most outspoken critics at that time were Wisconsin Senator Robert La Follette and Minnesota Congressman Charles Lindbergh. Hardly a week passed without one of them delivering a scathing speech against what they called, quote, the money trust, which was responsible, they said, for deliberately creating economic booms and busts in order to reap the profits of salvaging foreclosed homes, farms, and businesses. If anyone doubted that such a trust really existed, their skepticism was abruptly terminated when La Follette publicly charged that the entire country was controlled by just 50 men. The monetary scientists were not dismayed, nor did they even bother to deny it. In fact, when George F. Baker, who was a partner of J.P. Morgan, was asked by reporters for his reaction to La Follette's claim, he replied that it was totally absurd. He knew from personal knowledge, he said, that the number was not more than 8. That's funny. Okay, so that quote was from Mullins, page 16. The public was, of course, outraged, and the pressure predictably mounted for Congress to do something. The monetary scientists were fully prepared to turn this reaction to their own advantage. The strategy was simple. One, set up a special congressional committee to investigate the money trust. Two, make sure the committee is staffed by friends of the trust itself. And three, conceal the full scope of the trust operation while revealing just enough to intensify the public clamor for reform. Once the political climate was hot enough, then the Aldrich Bill could be put forward, supposedly, as the answer to that need. This strategy was certainly not new. As Congressman Lindbergh explained, quote, ever since the Civil War, Congress has allowed the bankers to completely control financial legislation. The membership of the Finance Committee in the Senate and the Committee on Banking and Currency in the House has been made up of bankers, their agents, and attorneys. These committees have controlled the nature of the bills to be reported, the extent of them, and the debates that were to be held on them when they were being considered in the Senate and the House. Not one, no one, not on the committee is recognized unless someone favorable to the committee has been arranged for. And that was from Lindbergh, page 76. Turning the opposition against itself. Now that the basic strategy was in place and a specific bill had been drafted, the next step, sorry, I think I read that. Okay. Sorry about that. Okay. The Pujo Committee. The Pujo Committee was a perfect example of this kind of chicanery. It was a subcommittee of the House Committee on Banking and Currency, and it was given the awesome responsibility of conducting the famous, quote, money trust investigation of 1912. Its chairman was Arsene Pujo of Louisiana, who, true to form, was regarded by many as a spokesman for the, quote, oil trust. The hearings dragged on for 8 months, producing volumes of dry statistics and self-serving testimony of the great Wall Street bankers themselves. At no time were the financiers asked any questions about their affairs with foreign investment houses, nor were they asked about their response to competition from new banks. There were no questions about their plan to protect the speculative banks from currency drains, or their motive for wanting artificially low interest rates, or their formula for passing on their losses to the taxpayer. The public was given the impression that Congress was really prying off the lid of scandal and corruption, but the reality was more like a fireside chat between old friends. No matter what vagaries or absurdities fell from the banker's lips, it was accepted without contest. These hearings were conducted largely as a result of the public accusations made by Congressman Lindbergh and Senator La Follette. Yet, when they requested to appear before the committee, both of them were denied access. The only witnesses to testify were the bankers themselves and their friends. Coco tells us, quote, fortunately for the reformers, the Pujo Committee swung into high gear in its investigation of the money trust during the summer of 1912, and for 8 months frightened the nation with its awesome, if inconclusive, statistics on the power of Wall Street over the nation's economy. 5 banking firms, the elaborate tables of the committee showed, held 341 directorships in 112 corporations with an aggregate capitalization of over $22 billion. The evidence seemed conclusive, and the nation was suitably frightened into realizing that reform of the banking system was urgent, presumably to bring Wall Street under control. The orgy of Wall Street was resurrected by the newspapers, who quite ignored the fact that the biggest advocates of banking reform were the bankers themselves, bankers with a somewhat different view of the problem, yet it was largely the Pujo hearings that made the topic of banking reform a serious one. And that quote was from Coco, Triumph, page 220. Coco has touched upon an interesting point. Almost no one put any significance to the fact that some of the biggest bankers on Wall Street were the first marchers to lead the parade for banking reform. The most conspicuous among these was Paul Warburg of Kuhn, Loeb and Company, who for 7 years prior to passage of the Federal Reserve Act traveled around the country doing nothing but giving, quote, reform speeches and writing scholarly articles for the media, including an 11-part series for the New York Times. Spokesmen from the houses of Morgan and Rockefeller joined in and made regular appearances before professional and political bodies, echoing the call for reform. Yet no one paid any attention to the unmistakable odor of fish. Enlisting the help of academia. The speeches and articles by big-name bankers were never intended to sway the public at large. They served the function of putting forth the basic arguments that the technical details which were to be the starting point for the work of others who could not be accused of having self-serving motives. To carry the message to the voters, it was decided that representatives from the world of academia should be enlisted to provide the necessary aura of respectability and intellectual objectivity. For that purpose, the banks contributed a sum of $5 million to a special, quote, educational fund, and much of that money found its way into the environs of three universities, Princeton, Harvard, and the University of Chicago, all of which had been recipients of large endowments from the captains of industry and finance. It was precisely at this time that the study of, quote, economics was becoming a new and acceptable field, and it was not difficult to find talented but slightly hungry professors who, in turn for a grant or a prestigious appointment, were eager to expound the virtues of the Jekyll Island plan. Not only was such academic pursuit financially rewarding, it also provided national recognition for them as pioneers in the new field of economics. Galbraith says, quote, under Aldrich's direction, a score or more of studies of monetary institutions in the United States, and more particularly in other countries, were commissioned from the emergent economics profession. It is at least possible that the reverence in which the Federal Reserve System has since been held by economists owes something to the circumstance that so many who pioneered in the profession participated also in the system's birth. That quote was from Galbraith, page 121. The principal accomplishment of the Bankers Educational Fund was to create an organization called the National Citizens League. Although it was entirely financed and controlled by the banks under the personal guidance of Paul Warburg, it presented itself merely as a group of concerned citizens seeking banking reform. The function of the organization was to disseminate hundreds of thousands of, quote, educational pamphlets, to organize letter writing campaigns to congressmen, to supply quotable material to the news media, and in other ways to create the illusion of grassroots support for the Jekyll Island plan. Nathaniel Stevenson, in his biography of Nelson Aldrich, says, quote, the League was nonpartisan. It was careful to abstain from emphasizing Senator Aldrich. First and last, hundreds of thousands of dollars were spent by the League to popularizing financial science. And that quote was from Stevenson, page 388 and 389. The man chosen to head up that effort was an economics professor by the name of J. Lawrence Laughlin. Coco says that, quote, Laughlin, nominally very orthodox in his commitment to laissez-faire theory, was nevertheless a leading academic advocate of banking regulation and was sensitive to the needs of banking as well as the realities of politics. And that quote was from Coco, Triumph, page 187. Did his appointment bring intellectual objectivity to the new organization? Stevenson answers, quote, Professor Laughlin of the University of Chicago was given charge of the League's propaganda. And that quote was from Stevenson, page 388. To which Congressman Lindbergh adds this reminder, quote, the reader knows that the University of Chicago is an institution endowed by John D. Rockefeller with nearly $50 million. It may truly be said to be the Rockefeller University. And that quote was from Lindbergh, page 131. This does not necessarily mean that Laughlin was purchased like so many pounds of hamburger and told by Rockefeller what to say and do. It doesn't work that way. The professor undoubtedly believed in the virtue of the Jekyll Island plan, and the evidence is that he pursued his assignment with enthusiastic sincerity. But there is no doubt that he was selected for his new post precisely because he did support the concept of a partnership between banking and government as a healthy institute for, quote, destructive competition. In other words, if he didn't honestly agree with John D. that competition was a sin, he probably never even would have been given a professorship in the first place. And that quote was from, a footnote on that. For an excellent overview of the formation and activities of the League, see Cocoa Triumph, page 186 to 228. Wilson and Wall Street. Woodrow Wilson was yet another academic who was brought into the national spotlight as a result of his views on banking reform. It will be recalled from a previous chapter that Wilson's name had been put into nomination for president at the Democratic National Convention, largely due to the influence of Colonel Edward Mandell House. But that was in 1912. 10 years prior to that, he was relatively unknown. In 1902, he had been elected as the president of Princeton University, a position he could not have held without the occurrence of the university's benefactors among Wall Street bankers. He was particularly close with Andrew Carnegie, or Carnegie, some people might pronounce it as, and had become a trustee for the Carnegie Foundation. Two of the most generous donors were Cleveland H. Dodge and Cyrus McCormick, directors of Rockefeller's National City Bank. They were part of that Wall Street elite, which the Pujo Committee had described as America's, quote, money trust. Both men had been Wilson's classmates at Princeton University. When Wilson returned to Princeton as a professor in 1890, Dodge and McCormick were, by reason of their wealth, university trustees, and they took it upon themselves to personally advance his career. Sorry, I got a lot of cottonmouth today. Ferdinand Lundberg in America's 60 Families says this, quote, for nearly 20 years before his nomination, Woodrow Wilson had moved in the shadow of Wall Street. In 1898, Wilson, his salary unsatisfactory, besieged with offers of many university presidencies, threatened to resign. Dodge and McCormick thereupon constituted themselves his financial guardians and agreed to raise the additional informal stipendium that kept him at Princeton. The contributors to this private fund were Dodge, McCormick, and Moses Taylor Pine. I think that's how you pronounce it. And Percy R. Pine of the family that founded the National City Bank. In 1902, this same group arranged Wilson's election as president of the university. And that quote was from Lundberg, page 114 and 115. A grateful Wilson often had spoken in glowing terms about the rise of vast corporations and had praised J.P. Morgan as a great American leader. He also had come to acceptable conclusions about the value of a controlled economy. Quote, the old time of individual competition is probably gone by, he said. It may come back. I don't know. It will not come back within our time, I dare say. And that quote was from Greiter, page 276. H.S. Keenan tells us the rest of the story. Quote, Woodrow Wilson, president of Princeton University, was the first prominent educator to speak in favor of the Aldrich Plan, a gesture which immediately brought him the governorship of New Jersey and later the presidency of the United States. During the Panic of 1907, Wilson declared that all this trouble could be averted if we appointed a committee of 6 or 7 public-spirited men like J.P. Morgan to handle the affairs of our country. And that quote was from H.S. Keenan, the Federal Reserve Bank, Los Angeles, Noontide Press, 1966, page 105. Opposition to the Aldrich Bill. One of the disagreements at the Jekyll Island meeting was over the name to be attached to the proposed legislation. Warburg, being the master psychologist he was, wanted it to be called the National Reserve Bill or the Federal Reserve Bill, something which would conjure up the dual images of government and reserves, both of which were calculated to be subconsciously appealing. Aldrich, on the other hand, acting out of personal ego, insisted that his name be attached to the bill. Wahlberg pointed out that the Aldrich name was associated in the minds of the public with Wall Street interests, and that would be an unnecessary obstacle to achieving the goal. Aldrich said that since he had been the chairman of the National Monetary Commission, which was created specifically to make recommendations for banking reform, people would be confused if his name was not associated with the bill. The debate, we were told, the debate, we are told, was long and heated, but in the end, the politician's ego won out over the banker's logic. Wahlberg, of course, was right. Aldrich was well known as a Republican spokesman for big business and banking. His loyalties were further publicized by recently sponsored tariff bills to protect the tobacco and rubber trusts. The Aldrich name on the bill for the banking reform was an easy target for the opposition. On December 15, 1911, Congressman Lindbergh rose before the House of Representatives and took careful aim. Quote, the Aldrich Plan is the Wall Street Plan. It is a broad challenge to the government by the champion of the money trust. It means another panic, if necessary, to intimidate the people. Aldrich, paid by the government to represent the people, proposes a plan for the trusts instead. And this was quoted by H.S. Keenan, page 118. The Aldrich bill never came to a vote. When the Republicans lost control of the House in 1910 and then lost the Senate and the presidency in 1912, any hope there may have been of putting through a Republican bill was lost. Aldrich had been voted out of the Senate by his constituents, and the ball was now squarely in the court of the Democrats and their new president, Woodrow Wilson. How this came to pass is an interesting lesson on reality politics, and we shall turn to that part of the story next. Summary. Banking in the period immediately prior to the passage of the Federal Reserve Act was subject to a myriad of controls, regulations, subsidies, and privileges at both the federal and state levels. Popular history portrays this period as one of unbridled competition and free banking. Let me take a sip of water here. Got some cotton mouth today. All right. Where was I? It was, in fact, a halfway house to central banking. Wall Street, however, wanted more government participation. The New York bankers particularly wanted, quote, a lender of last resort to create unlimited amounts of fiat money for their use in the event they were exposed to bank runs or currency drains. They also wanted to force all banks to follow the same inadequate reserve policies so that more cautious ones would not draw down the reserve of the others. An additional objective was to limit the growth of new banks in the South and West. This was a time of growing enchantment with the idea of trusts and cartels. For those who had already made it to the top, competition was considered chaotic and wasteful. Wall Street was snowballing into two major banking groups, the Morgans and the Rockefellers, and even they had largely ceased competing with each other in favor of cooperative financial structures. But to keep these cartels combines from flying apart, to keep these cartel combines from flying apart, a means of discipline was needed to force the participants to abide by the agreements. The federal government was brought in as a partner to serve that function. To sell the plan to Congress, the cartel reality had to be hidden, and the name, quote, central bank had to be avoided. The word federal was chosen to make it sound like it was a government operation. The word reserve was chosen to make it appear financially sound. And the word system, the first drafts used the word association, was chosen to conceal the fact that it was a central bank. A structure of 12 regional institutions was conceived as a further ploy to create the illusion of decentralization, but the mechanism was designed from the beginning to operate as a central bank closely modeled after the Bank of England. The first draft of the Federal Reserve Act was called the Aldrich Bill and was co-sponsored by Congressman Vreeland. But it was not the work of either of these politicians. It was the brainchild of banker Paul Warburg and was actually written by bankers Frank Vanderlip and Benjamin Strong. Aldrich's name attached to a banking bill was bad strategy because he was known as a Wall Street senator. His bill was not politically acceptable and was never released from committee. The groundwork had been done, however, and the time had arrived to change labels and political parties. The measure would now undergo minor cosmetic surgery and reappear under the sponsorship of a politician whose name would be associated in the public mind with anti-Wall Street sentiments. Wow. End of chapter 21. That's very interesting. It's kind of, one of the things about history is you could kind of see how history repeats itself, right? Um, However that plays out. And sometimes I wonder if it's because people don't study history that they repeat it, or if they do study it, that they repeat it on purpose because of their, intention. I don't know. Very interesting, eh? But anyways, I hope you enjoyed that. We will continue our reading next time with a new chapter. And in the meantime, I hope you guys all have a great day, great afternoon, great night, great evening, great week, wherever you guys are. All right. Okay, bye-bye now.